right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. So this week, as world leaders and dignitaries are gathering in New York, we are taking a look at climate change. So this is called Climate Change NYC. And so there's going to be a lot of meetings and talks about our changing planet. And so this week, in partnership with the Explorers Club, we are talking to researchers and scientists and explorers who are researching the issues, documenting what's happening so that they can share it with the public, and then, of course, looking for solutions. So if you visit our website, exploringbytheseat.com, under the event section, you can find Climate Change NYC or Climate Week NYC, and you can find all the events we have coming up, ranging everywhere from corals to polar bears to citizen science and everything in between. So you're going to want to check out more of the events that we have coming up over the course of the week. So we're going to take a little virtual trip to Australia, where we have Emma Camp joining us today. She's a coral biologist and explorer, and she's focused on identifying the world's most extreme coral systems and studying these super corals to look for new strategies to help our struggling coral reefs. So she has undertaken over 30 research expeditions, has supervised and mentored numerous research students. And for her, it's really important to try and inspire that next generation of scientists. And of course, to get out into the ocean and see these incredible ecosystems. So I'm going to bring Emma in live with us right now. Hey, Emma, how you doing?
Good, thanks, Joe. Good to see you.
All right, Emma, it's great to have you joining us as well. The computer is a little bit laggy right now, but hopefully once we get started, things will catch up.
Okay, I can hear you good. So yeah, fingers crossed.
Perfect. All right, Emma, I'm going to let you take over for a little bit, and then we'll do some Q&A with our classrooms.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. So hi, everybody. It is a pleasure to be able to speak with you all today. So as Joe said, my name is Emma. I'm a coral biologist and I'm based here in Sydney. It's actually 4 a.m. for me, so I've got up nice and early to speak with you all. But that's because this is really my passion. And so I'm excited to talk to you about what's going on with our coral reefs, and in particularly what my research focus is, which is trying to find some of the world's toughest corals that are really essential for us, as we know that they're facing a lot of stressors with climate change. Before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge and extend my deepest respects to the traditional custodians of the land and sea countries where I get to work. So for here, that's from Sydney up to the Cairns Port Douglas region on the Great Barrier Reef, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge, language, and culture. So really quickly, I think it's super important to just understand what a coral reef is, because if we understand what they are, it can help us understand why they're so impacted by climate change. As coral biologists, we often think of coral reefs as kind of the canary in the coal mine, and they are these ecosystems that really give us an early warning sign that things are happening in the environment, and that we have a lot of instability going on. So coral reefs are normally these really bright, vibrant, and diverse ecosystems. If we zoom in, they're actually formed by individual corals. They form a calcium carbonate structure, so kind of a chalk material, and that's what makes that big structure that we can see, for example, from space. So the Great Barrier Reef, it's the size of Italy. You can see it from space, and that's because these corals produce that structure that forms the home and the basis for many marine organisms on a reef. But if we zoom in further, the actual individual polyps that make up a coral are very small. They are colonial organisms, and each of those individual polyps have their own mouth. They're closely related to a jellyfish. And you can see a close-up image now there. And if we zoom in even closer, we can see that there are these tiny microscopic algae that live inside the tissue, and they photosynthesize, give the animal a lot of its energy. So you can kind of think of the coral as a factory, the algae cells as the solar panels of that factory, giving the energy source to that structure. And then we have bacteria, viruses, all of these other microorganisms that actually are like the workers. They move the resources around the coral system. So corals are really, really, really complex. As a scientist, we would call them a holobiont, which is the whole biology, because they really are their own kind of unique ecosystem. But why do we care about reefs? Well, they provide support services, so they're really important for juvenile fish stocks and environmental regulation. They have huge cultural significance for many people around the world. They support industries such as fisheries, tourism industry, and they have, a really protective mechanism as well for coastal communities. So if waves come in or cyclones, hurricanes, reefs are the first barrier of defense to stop coastal erosion. So really diverse and important ecosystem services. But unfortunately, there are many threats now occurring for coral reefs, and many of those are linked to anthropogenic, so human-induced stressors. So things like changes in water quality, which can lead to things like invasive species, physical damage, and really some of the big three stresses that we see because of climate change are warming, acidification, and low oxygen. So as we produce more fossil fuel emissions, that gets absorbed by the oceans, and it basically changes the chemistry of the ocean. It makes it more acidic, it reduces the amount of oxygen, and it also results in marine heat waves and warming of the ocean, all of which can destabilize coral reefs. And so these three stresses of climate change in particular are a real threat, because they leave us with a risk that reefs, at least as we know them, may not exist into the future. So a recent report by the United Nations said that if we continue on our trajectory of warming, and if we reach 1.5 degrees of warming on the planet, that 70 to 90% of coral reefs could be lost. And if we reach 2 degrees of warming, only 1% of coral reefs will be left. So for us as coral biologists and scientists, this is a really alarming statistic. And so we're having to rethink how can we conserve our reefs? How can we manage them to ensure that they survive? But also that the functions and the services that reefs provide to so many people around the world and to so much marine life are also conserved. So this is just an example of some images taken of a site in the Seychelles. So I was lucky enough to visit the Seychelles, a small island group near the coast of Africa, and I'd been studying this site for about 5 or 6 years until I was there in 2016. And that middle image you can see is an example of what a reef looks like during a mass coral bleaching event. It was white, as far as I could see, about 2 football pitches in size. Everything just went an eerie white. And that's because it was too hot, and that algae that gives the coral its colour as well as its energy source left. And then unfortunately, the temperature didn't come down quick enough, and that reef system actually transitioned to mortality. So you can see that far right image there showing what the reef looks like once it's died. So for me, when I started my research career, it was like, what can we do about this? What are the solutions that exist for us to try and buy time to aid coral reefs? And really, there's a toolbox of approaches that are being considered. Things from trying to speed up the evolution of corals, so actually looking at ways we can assist the evolution of corals to make them more resilient, looking at ways we can adjust our traditional marine management, looking at ways that we can reduce the stress on reefs. So even things like creating clouds that can be generated above a reef to try and reduce the amount of light stress they get, because that can make the temperature stress worse. A whole array of options are being considered by the research community. But for me, my interest really was if we look to nature, are there corals that are naturally surviving, that are really tough, that are really resilient? And if there are, where are they and how can we learn from them? So for this journey, we're going to come back to the Seychelles. And this is where my journey really started in a mangrove lagoon. You can see that on the far left there, where it was a really sheltered lagoon where corals existed, very isolated coral colonies. But the conditions there were really interesting. They were really hot, they were really acidic, and they had really low oxygen conditions. So if you remember back to that slide where I was talking about the stresses that reefs face, these were the stresses that we know corals are going to have to contend with in the future. And so the fact that we had corals surviving in this system, and actually they were living in conditions more extreme than we're predicting for the year 2100, for me as a scientist was just, really exciting, gave me some hope that some corals will survive into the future. But also that there's these natural laboratories that exist around the world that we can explore to try and say, well, which corals are surviving there? How are they surviving? How can we learn from them? And importantly, how can we take what we learn and try to improve the management of our reef systems? So these are just some pictures of the types of corals that we saw in that system, and you can see they're actually quite diverse. And an important observation is sometimes we just have isolated colonies that live in these extreme systems, but sometimes we get these real true reef structures, and they're the ones that are really interesting because we want that function, we want that reef structure, because that's sort of a really important barrier that we need for the protection of the coast, but also provide the structure for the marine life on the reef system. So after the Seychelles, we said, okay, where else can we find these systems? And we looked around and we found that actually the more we looked, the more we found these extreme systems, particularly mangrove lagoons. So it seemed to be something about having mangroves with channels going into it that created these hot, acidic, low oxygen environments. And so in the Caribbean, in Indonesia, in the Seychelles, everywhere we were starting to look across the different oceans, we were seeing these extreme corals existing. So we're going to go now to New Caledonia. So that is a site just off of the coast. It's an island to the east of Australia. Now, this was a really interesting site. So you can see in the top left there, you'll see Boracay Municipal Camping Ground, but you'll see that that's what the mangrove lagoons look like from Google Earth. So I took an image, you can see there that there's kind of this green, sort of very dark green, dense mangrove patch. And then you can see a channel that goes into that in sort of a bean kidney shape. And so actually how we found a lot of these extreme systems was by using aerial imagery to try and look to see where are we finding these sorts of structures near to coral reefs, and then let's go there and see if there are coral reefs and if we see these extreme systems. So this was a site that we turned up at, and we were really excited. That far right picture may not look that exciting, but those yellow blobs under the water is coral. So when you go to a new site, you spend a lot of time and effort and money and resources to get there, and you're not quite sure what you're going to find. So seeing those colours under the water is a really positive and exciting sign as a scientist. And so this system was really interesting. We saw immense biodiversity, actually some more biodiversity than even the neighbouring reef sites. So this has become now quite a long-term study site for our team, but also our collaborators in New Caledonia. So we put sensors out, so you can see that kind of torpedo-looking device on the top right. That is a logger that measures temperature, pH, oxygen salinity over long periods of time. So we've deployed that to get a really good understanding of how variable these conditions are. But we also take micro fragments and bring them back to the lab to do different analysis. So you can see here the little light being flashed on that. So that we use an instrument to be able to kind of give us an indication of the health of the corals. How healthy are they in these systems despite the conditions? And surprisingly, we find that actually they're functioning very similar to the reef corals, but they their physiology, the way that they behave is slightly different. So again, you can see that we when we're in the field, we sort of make these labs which allow us to take samples. And I put this picture on here because that was actually my home for a week. So we stayed in a shipping container and made that our lab, but also our accommodation. So one of the fun things about exploration and about the work that we do is that it's often to remote places where people don't often go. So you're sort of resourceful to try and set things up to work for what you need. And so here's an example of that, turning a kitchen table into a lab in a shipping container. And so we took coral fragments and have analysed those and found that they're genetically very different as well to the reef corals, and that they have different type of algae. So we're starting to get clues about what makes them tolerant. So then we were lucky enough in 2017, 2018 to get some funding from National Geographic and look for the first time on the Great Barrier Reef to see if there were supercorals on the Great Barrier Reef. And if yes, where were they? And again, how could we use those to improve our management, thinking about the fact that on the Great Barrier Reef, we've had now 4 mass coral bleaching events over the last 6 to 7 years. And in 2016 and 2017 alone, about 50% of the Great Barrier Reef was impacted by bleaching and about 30% died. So we know that, particularly here in Australia, finding alternate solutions is really, really crucial. So we, again, did a very similar approach to what I explained for New Caledonia. We looked at maps, we spoke to local people to find out where there may be these kind of mangrove corals existing. And we were really lucky. Again, the sites that we kind of predicted, most of them did have corals. And so a little bit different now. Now in Australia, we wanted to kind of set up some more baseline data. So we collected water samples to also see if we could find out what it was that was making the corals more tolerant. So is it the environment, or is it the corals themselves adapting to that environment? And that's a really important distinction, because if it's the environment, they're actually more of a refuge, because it means the corals need to stay in that environment to be able to keep their tolerance. Whereas if it is the individuals adapting to that environment, then we can maybe move those corals to new systems, and that can provide us with an alternate restoration practice for reefs. So we took water samples so we could understand what was special about the mangrove waters and how the corals were shaping that. Here's some just aerial footage, and you can see me. I'm the little blob in the middle of that channel. And you can see how I'll kind of swim in those channels, be looking for corals. Doing this on the Great Barrier Reef is always fun, because we have crocodiles in a lot of the mangroves along the Great Barrier Reef. So there's often a boat very close to me. You can't see it in this picture, because yeah, that's something that we're often very aware of, and is not something that I would want to come face to face with on my coral collections. And actually in the National Geographic expedition was the first time that I'd heard a crocodile whilst in the mangroves, and it kind of barks. It has a real bark noise, and I've never kind of moved so quickly to get back onto the boat ever. So it's not a sound that I want to hear again anytime soon. Now, once we found these corals, and I mentioned that we wanted to understand if they were naturally resilient, or if it was the environment that was kind of helping them maintain that resilience. So what we did was set up what we call a transplantation study. So you can see that there's a frame behind me in this picture. And so what we did was we would take little fragments of the coral, put them onto this frame and keep it in the mangroves. But then we'd also take some of the mangrove corals and put them on the adjacent reef. And then we would find the same species on the reef, put it on a frame in the reef, and then move some of it into the mangrove system. And by moving the corals across the two environments and leaving them for a period of time, we were able to assess whether the corals maintained their tolerance or not. And we would do this by kind of assessing their physiology, but also taking small molecular samples that we could take back to the lab here in Sydney and analysed their genetics to see how they were functioning. And what we found was that actually after 1 to 2 years, the corals maintained their tolerance when they were moved out of the mangrove systems. This is really, really exciting because this tells us that actually they are naturally tolerant. They're adapting to that environment, and they may indeed provide us an alternative means to better manage reefs by incorporating some of these supercorals in our current activities. And so to do that, we have been looking at ways we can kind of restore the reef, restore high value sites by propagating coral and outplanting it. So we have these nursery structures. We're working with the tourism industry to put these nursery structures at high value sites on the Great Barrier Reef. And we're basically taking supercorals, but also regular corals, starting to propagate them in these nurseries and then plant the corals back onto the reef with the goal that we can hopefully build up ecological resilience at sites where we have the most economic or ecological value. Now, this process is really consuming in terms of time, effort, resources. So at the moment, these restoration efforts are only happening at a really small scale. So if we think about the fact that the Great Barrier Reef is the size of Italy, we're really only working at a small scale at the moment. So it's important to realise that the scale of conservation for these sorts of efforts at the moment are still local scale, but the goal is obviously to try to increase that as the need to do this increases. So the Coral Nurture Programme, where we've been doing these activities, has outplanted over 100,000 corals since 2018, and our goal is to continue to do that and hopefully build the resilience of the reef into the future. So to end, I'm going to give you this quote by Sylvia Earle. She's one of the, one of my kind of idols. She's a marine biologist, and she has this quote, and it says, "Many of us ask, what can I as one person do? But history shows us that everything good and bad starts because somebody does or does not do something." So it has been great to speak with you all today, and I look forward to taking some questions from you. But I also want to challenge each of you here today to think, what can you do, whether or not it's for reefs or other ecosystems, to make a difference by reducing our impact on the planet and ultimately working together to conserve it. So I'm going to end there, and I really look forward to hearing from you and any questions you have.
All right, Emma, thank you so much for taking us into the world of coral reefs and also your adventures as you look for the supercorals that we can use to help some of these systems survive. So before we jump into a little Q&A action, we're going to play a little Kahoot together and see how well our students were paying attention. We'll see who comes out on top in today's Kahoot. So I'm going to share my screen. Should just take a moment here to load. And you can see you need to visit kahoot.it. That's the website. And then it's going to ask you for a PIN number. Today's PIN is 443-8354. And then you'll get your auto-generated animal name, and you will be ready to go. If you have one-to-one technology at your seat, you can load up here on a Chromebook or a tablet or something like that. If not, no big deal. Your teacher could load this screen at the front of their classroom, and you can shout out your answers to him or her. If you don't have any technology that you can use, that's fine. You can just shout out your answers and see how you do. If you have something handy like a mobile device, tablet, you can scan that QR code and it will bring you right in. I can see we've got the magic possum and the aquatic. Oh, I lost that one, went too fast. We've got the creative bee, the rockstar hare, amusing yeti. So we're getting all kinds of great names here as our students are joining us. And once we finish our Kahoot, we will get into some Q&A action. I believe there are 5 questions today, and some are true and false. Some are multiple choice. If you get the answer right, you get some points. If you get it right and you do it really quickly, you get even more points. It doesn't matter how fast you put in the wrong answer. There are no points for you. Okay, I think things are... Oh, spoke a little too soon. Oh, I'm going to give it another minute. While we do that, I'm going to take a question from the chat for you, Emma, while we let a few more students join. So,
that sounds great.
Let's see. Okay, here's an interesting one. This is from a grade 5-6 class here in Canada, and they're wondering, where are some of the oldest corals found?
That is a great question. So interestingly, some of the oldest corals are going to be fossils that we find on land. And actually, I recently got contacted by a construction company in Florida who were digging up the side of a road, and they had all of these old fossils that they had found whilst doing that. And they basically were like, can you, like, where do we send these? Like, do you want them? And so most of them would be on land because we've seen the changes in tides and currents moving like the water system out and basically, you know, forming the land structure. So your oldest would be fossils that we find there. Some of the biggest corals that we have is generally our oldest ones. So again, the reef will build up on top of each other. So some places we find these really big, old, massive corals would be some of our oldest ones. So yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, it kind of depend on the location, and the size is normally a pretty good indicator of that.
Okay, well, let's get in our Kahoot action. It looks like we are ready to go. So here we go. Remember, 20 seconds for each question. The quicker you get your answer in, and if it's right, the more points you're going to get. So here we go. True or false to start? Coral reefs are like warning systems for changes in the marine environment. Is that true or is that false? Whoa, we had like 70 answers in under 3 seconds. It's pretty fast. Coral reefs are like warning systems for changes in the marine environment. Got about 5 more seconds to get your answer locked in. Okay, so that is true. They're like the canaries in the coal mine. You can often see changes in the coral when things are changing, like the temperature or the chemistry of the water. So that puts the epic impala holding down that top spot. Let's go to a multiple choice question. Which is an example of a service coral reefs provide for us? Is it providing habitat for marine life? They're important for tourism, providing shore protection, or is it all of the above? So which is an example of service coral reefs provide for us? Habitats, tourism, shore protection, or all of the above? All right, so we had all of the above. Inching to victory. Many pick the first one, which is absolutely correct, but you also have to keep an eye on the questions because sometimes there might be more than one answer that's right. So that didn't change. Well, it changed a lot of things down below, but Epic Impala is still holding on strong. Our next question, if we reach 2 degrees of warming, coral will be fine. About 70% of coral will be lost. Only 1% of coral will survive, or coral will just start to reproduce faster. So if we reach 2 degrees of warming, coral will be fine. 70% loss, only 1% survival, or coral will reproduce faster. All right, so 1.5 would be about 70 to 90% being lost, whereas if it did go all the way to that 2 degrees, we'd see only about 1% of coral surviving. The kind pelican has taken that top spot. We've got a true and false coming up. No corals can exist in warm, acidic water. Is that true or is that false? That no corals can exist in warm, acidic waters. Got a couple more seconds to get your answer in. All right, so we did learn today that that is false. In some environments like those mangrove ecosystems, there are supercorals that can live in those warmer acidic waters. Of course, if things get too acidic and too warm, then even those supercorals probably would struggle to survive. Kind pelican is holding on. We've got one question before we switch to Q&A. How many mass bleaching events have occurred on the Great Barrier Reef in the last 10 years? So mass bleaching events, was it 2, 4, 6, or 8 of those mass bleaching events where the algae leaves the coral, and then if conditions don't improve and the algae doesn't return, then those coral can die. So 2, 4, 6, or 8 events. All right, so we learned today that it's 4 events that have taken place recently. So let's look at our podium. In third place, we've got the amiable mouse. In second place, we have the kind pelican, which means we have a new leader holding down that top spot. Who's got it? It is, oh, the epic impala sneaking back in from the beginning. All right. Very, very cool. Well, students, thank you so much for playing along a little Kahoot action with us. Now let's change gears to some Q&A. We're going to visit our camera classrooms in person, and then we will also take questions from the chat. So let's start off. Mr. Kim's grade 11 biology class is hanging out with us today. Let's get them in front and center. How are we doing, everyone? All right, bio crew.
Oh, wait, they can't hear us. Hang on.
Oh, no, we
come on.
Now. You're good. Oh, no, now you're back.
Can you hear us? Oh, there we go. There we go. Hi. Say hi.
Hi. Hi.
All right. Who's got a question for Emma?
Who's got a question?
Well, that's a shame.
I can come back if you want a chance to come up with one. I'll come back. Okay. All right. We've got Mrs. Ball's crew hanging out with us. Let's bring them in front and center. How are we doing in grade 10 science?
I don't know. How's it going? What question do we have? I got one here. They talked about bringing in new species to the reef, and I just get concerned about invasive species. How are we balancing that?
Yep. So that's a great question, and definitely something to be concerned and mindful of. And so the way that we're trying to kind of account for that is to not move species too far geographically, but also that the species is found within the environment where we're working. So when we move, say, the supercorals onto the reef, that species is already found on the reef. It's just that genetically they're a little bit different. So certain genes are turned on or off, which seem to be giving them that tolerance. So we try to basically limit how far we move them, but also make sure that actually that species is already in that environment. It's just that the ones that we've got have got that enhanced tolerance. And it's that question is front and center of a lot of conservation discussions, because we don't want like the cane toad outbreaks that we've had here in Australia. Like that's definitely not what we want to do. So great question.
All right. Let's jump to another classroom here. We have a crew from Grisham Middle School in Texas hanging out with us. How are we doing today?
How long does it normally take to do that operation of bringing one part of the coral reef to the other?
Great question. It's normally a kind of a full-day activity to do that. So we would have a boat, we'd have a team of divers, we'd go into one environment, collect the corals, bring them back onto the boat, move them to the other environment, and then repeat that the other way. So it's normally about a full day of activity with maybe 5 to 10 divers coordinating. So quite a lot of work.
All right. Let's grab a question here from YouTube, and then we'll go back to some of our camera classrooms. Okay, here's one from Miles, grade 5-6. He is joining us in Ontario and wondering, do storms have an effect on coral?
Yeah, absolutely. If they're a really big storm, and especially the corals, and if they become kind of too broken up, they'll sort of form a rubble and unfortunately won't likely survive. And the corals that are big, that are more like a basketball shape, they're typically less impacted. They grow slower, and they are just more cemented onto the reef. So it depends on the type of coral, it depends on the severity of the storm, but absolutely they could be impacted by severe storms.
Okay, snag another question here from this one's in Maine. This is Miss Whipple's crew, and they're wondering, do we have an idea of how many different species of coral there might be?
So I lost you for a second, Joe. How many different species of coral there are?
Yeah. Yep.
Was that the question?
Yep. They're wondering if we know how many there are and how many there might be.
Yeah. Yeah, so great question again. So it depends on the area. So in the kind of Caribbean region, we have typically less than 100 coral species found. But when we come over into the Indo-Pacific, we have upwards of 1,000 coral species. So yeah, and interestingly, as we're using genetics, as our technology is getting better, we're finding new species that we didn't know existed, because when we look at them, we think they're the same species, but when we actually do the genetics, we find out that they're different species. So we're still learning.
All right. We have some 7th and 8th graders in Woodstock, Ontario hanging out with us. Let me bring them into the call from Northdale. If you're able to hear and see us, let's get that mic unmuted and let's grab a question.
Oh.
Hey, everyone.
I'm not sure why the camera's not working, but we do have a question. Austin's going to ask one.
So what is a super coral? You mentioned that earlier.
We joined a little late, so we've got a few questions about what happened in the 10 minutes since we joined.
Sure. So Emma, can you talk a little bit about super coral? What is a super coral?
That's okay. Thanks, Austin. Yeah, thanks, Austin, and the class for the question. So a super coral is basically a coral that is living in an environment where it's got more tough. So it's being conditioned to survive in hostile conditions that are representative of what's going to become the norm in the future. So for me, the super corals I focus on are found in mangrove lagoons, where the conditions are hot, acidic, have low oxygen conditions. And by surviving in those environments, they've basically been preconditioned to hostile conditions. And so that super tolerance to survive those conditions gives us an interesting natural laboratory to see how corals may survive into the future under climate change, but also how we can use them in better management. So basically, super corals are more tolerant to stress, and they are something we're really interested in to see how we can use those tolerant individuals to better conserve the reefs that are under threat from climate change.
All right. Let's check in with our grade 11 biology crew and see if they are ready, if they've got a question on deck for us.
Hi.
Bye.
Sorry. Since the reef is dying, how much longer is it expected to last if it continues on the same path?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it really depends sort of on locations, like what their kind of longevity is. But what we know is that reefs are really resilient. So if we give corals a chance, they will recover. We've seen recovery on the Great Barrier Reef. We know that if there's time between each stress event, the corals can recover. They're resilient if we give them a chance. But if the frequency and intensity of the stressors, the marine heat waves, the bleaching events increase, then that's when we're going to erode the resilience and erode the capacity of reefs. So, it's case by case basis, but as we sort of had back in the Kahoot, and I mentioned that if it really depends on how quick we reach certain thresholds. So if we get to that 2 degrees of warming, then the estimates and the models are that 1% of reefs will remain. So it's really on us and our actions to kind of limit how quickly we warm the planet, and how quickly we come up with alternate solutions to aid the reef. So I remain optimistic, and we still have amazing coral cover. We still have the capacity to ensure a future for reefs. But really it's on us now to make that happen.
All right, great question. So, Mr. Shattuck's crew, there's a couple of questions here. I'm going to put them together because they want to know about the Great Barrier Reef. So, Alex would like to know, besides coral, what's the most common animal that you see on the Great Barrier Reef? And Claire wants to know what your best encounter was with something on the Great Barrier Reef.
Okay. Oh, these are good questions. Most common, well, it is still a coral, but I would say one of the most common things. So I talked a lot about hard corals that perform that structure, but actually we have soft corals that are also very common on the reef. So they may look like an anemone or something else, but they're actually still a coral, but they don't have a hard structure. So they're also really important, what we would call ecosystem engineers. So that's something else we would commonly see on the reef. And then, best encounter, that is a great question. I would actually say for me, the best encounter was probably finding the first kind of super corals on the reef. It was just, it was a lot of effort for us to kind of get up to these sites and just jumping in. And the first site, we didn't see many corals and we weren't sure if we were going to find them. So the first time that we did go into these lagoons and see these like super corals was really exciting. And I guess in terms of bigger creatures, I was lucky enough to go on a research trip where we went to the far north outer reefs and some really amazing sharks whilst diving off the reef there, which are less common in some of the inshore systems I work in. So yeah, some really good questions there.
All right, very cool. So Mr. Kim's bio class has a couple more questions. I'm going to head their way. If you're in a camera class and you have another question, just give me a wave at the camera or come up nice and close and I'll come back to your group. But let's get another one from our bio group.
Hi, I was wondering, because at the start you said that the corals were closely related to jellyfish. So I was just wondering how that might have happened.
Yes, this is a great question. So so the individual kind of polyp that we see, so I kind of zoomed in and it's like that. So they're really closely related to what we would call the Medusa jellyfish, which looks like that. And actually, if we were to invert a jellyfish, the genetic structure is really, really similar. The morphology is really similar to a jellyfish. And so we've done the genetics as a scientific community. And we basically see that Cnidaria, which is where kind of corals fall, part of that sort of classification is jellyfish. And so it's just evolved from that individual polyp. So because corals start as that individual polyp, that's really similar to the sort of jellyfish. And then obviously over time, it's evolved to be able to produce calcium carbonate and become colonial. So yeah, absolutely great question. If you Google like a Medusa jellyfish and a coral polyp, you'll see that they're like inverse of each other, and it's really cool. Great question.
All right.
Sorry.
No, go for it.
Why don't we just put ice cubes in the water?
So I wish it was that simple. I mean, that would be, a great solution if it was to work. But unfortunately, it would change the chemistry, the salinity, because it would be fresh water. And so unfortunately, wouldn't solve our issues. So we need to stop our fossil fuel emissions, reduce our impact on the planet, and then hopefully our reefs will continue to persist. But I like the innovative thinking.
All right. Texas crew, Grisham Middle School. I thought I saw a little bit of waving. Let's see.
So like what kind of animals do y'all see whenever y'all do y'all's dives?
So common things we see would be turtles, stingrays, variety of fish life, clownfish, anemones. So less common would be things like mantas, dugongs, sharks. But yeah, it's, the reef is buzzing with and teeming with life. And for me, one of the most exciting parts of being on the reef is that you never know what you're going to see. In Florida, for example, I came over the crest of a reef and a sawfish, like 2-meter sawfish, came over my head. They hadn't seen one on that reef for 11 years. Nobody believed me, but I got a picture, which was my only proof that I'd seen this sawfish. So yeah, that's the excitement. You never know what you're going to see.
All right. Very cool. Okay, let's get one more from you guys. I think I saw another wave.
So what have you found on the deepest part of the sea?
So that's a great question. So I do what we would call normal scuba diving. So I'm kind of limited to about 30 meters, about 110 feet when I'm diving. But there are scientists, I mentioned Sylvia Earle, there are some other amazing scientists that have gone down in ROVs, and they found, they've actually recently found coral, some of the deepest coral in the world, a new coral that's been found really deep. new species, but unfortunately also plastics and some human derived objects have been found really deep in the ocean as well. So we actually know less about the deep ocean than we do parts of space. So it's really, you know, we're really discovering in this space. Great question as well.
Great questions.
Yeah.
We'll check in quickly just in case our Northdale crew, if they have one more question for us. There they are.
Can you see us or no?
No,
it's
dark. That's okay. We hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
Carter,
go ahead.
Do some jellyfish die? No, I mean, do some coral die when you like bring it up?
Yeah, that's a great question. They would if we're not careful with them. So we have to be really careful how we cut them. We have to make sure that we keep them in seawater, out of the sun. And so how we handle them does take a lot of care because, yeah, if not, they would be stressed and they would die through that handling process. And obviously, that's not what we're trying to do. So, yeah, great question.
All right. Well, just before we wrap up, I see a question here in the chat from Jace, who's in grade 5. And I'm wondering if maybe this student saw one of our presentations with Jen Matthews, who you've connected us with, Emma. And she talks about coral and coral farts in particular. So this student, Chase, is wondering, what do corals smell like? Do they have a smell? Oh, did that come through?
Sorry, Joe, I lost you. Was it? Can you just repeat that one?
Yeah, Jace is wondering if coral has a smell. Does it have a distinctive smell?
Yeah. They do. And yeah, Jen, I think definitely spoke about some of their work in this space. So we're just discovering this. It's really cool. We know that corals do emit gases. They have a really distinct smell about them. If people come in the lab and I've been working on coral, people are like, what's that smell? And I'm like, sorry, it's coral, it's not me. And we know, for example, that there's one compound gas that corals release, something called DMSP, and it's actually involved in cloud production as an example. So we know that the connection between the ocean, the atmosphere, and coral is all interconnected, and we're really just discovering what that connection is now. So yeah, really cool research going on in this space. And yes, they do indeed have a smell, and it's quite distinctive and not always that pleasant.
All right. Well, I want to start off with a shout out to our classrooms. Thank you so much to our camera classes. Thank you to our classes on YouTube for sending in all of those great questions as well. And of course, playing Kahoot with us. Emma, it is always a pleasure to steal some of your time. Thank you for starting your day really early with us and bringing us into the world of super coral.
All good.
All right. Well, thanks so much. We're going to sign off for now. Hope everybody has a great week.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for the great questions.
Thanks, everyone.